The marble floor of the Frost Palace throne room was so cold, it burned through the thin gray wool of Elara's skirt. She knelt at the base of the dais, the heavy iron-bound scrolls of the kingdom's tax ledgers scattered around her on the freezing stone. Her fingertips were stained with black ink from the archive depths, and a faint smear of winter mud clung stubbornly to the hem of her dress, a gift from the palace guards who had shoved her into the courtyard earlier that morning for daring to approach the central hall. Above her, the silence of the court was absolute. The air smelled of expensive beeswax candles and heavy winter perfume thick enough to suffocate. King Alaric of Ethelgard stood by the throne, his broad shoulders encased in a midnight blue velvet coat that absorbed the pale, fractured light falling from the crystal chandeliers. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his silver pocket watch, tracing the edge of the royal crest. With a gloved thumb, his square jaw set in a line of profound, aristocratic irritation. Beside him, Lord Chancellor Vance stood draped in the heavy maroon robes of the Royal Council. A sneer was carved deep into his sallow face as he clutched the master ledger of kingdom laws against his chest like a shield. "An archivist," Vance said, his voice dropping into the silence like freezing rain. "A common girl from the lower vaults tracking mud onto the high marble. She claims the records requested for the Winter Solstice are incomplete, Your Grace. She claims there are discrepancies." Alaric snapped the pocket watch shut. The sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. He finally lowered his piercing frost-gray eyes to look at the woman kneeling before his throne. Elara did not flinch. She kept her spine perfectly straight, despite the coarse corset biting into her ribs, despite the bone-deep cold of the stone pressing into her knees. She picked up the final scroll, her breath pluming faintly in the frigid air, and lifted her chin. She did not lower her gaze. It was a severe breach of court etiquette, a dangerous insolence for a servant. But she held his stare with unblinking, hazel eyes. Underneath the high, stiff collar of her gray dress, a small silver signet ring pressed against her collarbone. The metal was warm from her skin. It was the only warmth she had left in the world. "Discrepancies," Alaric repeated. His voice was low, clipped and terrifyingly precise, carrying effortlessly across the 50 feet of polished stone. He stepped down the first marble stair, the silver embroidery on his coat catching the light. "You are employed to catalog history, archivist, not to rewrite it." "I rewrite nothing, Your Grace," Elara said. Her voice was quiet, steady, completely devoid of the trembling deference the king was accustomed to hearing. "I merely pointed out that the succession records from the year of your father's ascension are missing their final royal seals. The law requires—" "The law," Alaric interrupted, his tone turning to ice, "is determined by the crown, not by a girl who brings the dirt of the streets into my presence." He stopped on the final step, towering over her. He looked at her ink-stained fingers, her plain gray wool, the mud on her hem. There was no explosive rage in his face, only a cold, devastating dismissal. Alaric was a man built on the certainty of the documents his father had left behind. He trusted the structure of his world. He trusted the heavy master ledger in Vance's hands. He saw before him only a nuisance, a stain on the immaculate documented order of his court. "My king," Vance murmured, stepping forward with an oily, practiced smile. "She is a remnant of the old district. Her family was stripped of their standing years ago for harboring dissenters against your father. She is unworthy of speaking the names of your ancestors, let alone questioning their sacred decrees." Alaric did not look away from Elara. He saw the way her jaw locked tight, the way her small, calloused hands remained perfectly still over the gathered scrolls. She was not crying. She was not pleading for mercy. It disturbed him just slightly, how entirely unbroken she appeared while kneeling in the mud before a hostile court. But Alaric had spent his life terrified of the chaos of the past, fortifying his reign with unyielding rules. He believed in the absolute legitimacy of House Vane. He would not allow a commoner to cast doubt on the foundation of his kingdom. "Is that so?" Alaric said softly. He tilted his head, delivering the sentence that had been implicitly drafted for him by the very council that surrounded him. You come before my throne, carrying the dust of forgotten basement rooms, and you presume to lecture me on the legality of my own bloodline." Elara's fingers tightened on the iron binding of the scroll. "My mother's bloodline." She thought the words a silent, bloody scream behind her teeth. "The bloodline your father slaughtered so he could sit in that stolen chair. You are unworthy of the ground you kneel on," Alaric said, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. Every word was a hammer striking cold iron. "You are unworthy of the air in this hall, and you are entirely unworthy of speaking the name of House Vane. Return to the lower depths. If you ever bring your baseless discrepancies into the light of this court again, you will not leave this palace alive." The nobles gathered at the edges of the room whispered behind velvet-gloved hands. Vance smiled a thin, triumphant stretching of his pale lips and adjusted his grip on the forged ledger. Elara absorbed the blow. She felt the chill of the marble sink deeper into her bones, felt the crushing weight of the kingdom's false history pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at the man wearing the crown that belonged to her mother. He was handsome, regal, and completely blind. He was defending a legacy built on treason, wrapping himself in the dignity of a thief. Slowly, gracefully, Elara rose to her feet. She did not scramble. She did not rush. She stood with a fluid, terrifying dignity that made the whispering nobles suddenly fall silent. She brushed the dust from her gray wool skirt, ignoring the mud stain that would not yield. She looked Alaric dead in the eyes, her expression utterly composed. "I understand completely, Your Grace," Elara said. Her tone was so devoid of fear or submission that Alaric's gloved hand tightened instinctively on his pocket watch. "I will return to the archive. I will tend to the history you have commanded." She offered a flawless, shallow curtsy, the exact minimum required by law, yet executed with the mocking perfection of a high-born queen. Then she turned her back on the throne of Ethelgard and walked away. Her footsteps echoed down the long marble nave, a steady, measured rhythm. She did not run. She did not look back. Under her dress, her hand rose just a fraction, her thumb brushing the hidden silver chain against her collarbone. "Let him have his name." She thought the cold air rushing against her face as the heavy oak doors of the throne room opened before her. "Because when the Founder's Vault opens, he will learn. I was always too good for it." The royal archive of Ethelgard was a tomb built not for bodies, but for truths the kingdom wished to bury. Located 3 levels beneath the Frost Palace, it was a sprawling labyrinth of towering iron shelves, suffocating dust and a cold so absolute it felt like a living entity. There were no grand crystal chandeliers here, only the sputtering pale light of tallow candles struggling to burn in the thin freezing air. Elara sat at a scarred wooden table in the deepest corner of the vault, her breath rising in rhythmic white plumes. The gray wool of her dress provided little defense against the damp chill of the stone walls. The mud stain on her hem had dried into a stiff, pale crust. Her fingers, still stained with black ink from the morning's work, trembled slightly as she unrolled a crumbling parchment. It was an old census report, meaningless to anyone else, but to her it was a piece of the puzzle. A record of the noble houses that had been quietly dismantled the year King Alaric's father took the throne. The silence of the archive was heavy, pressing against her eardrums. In that crushing quiet, the small silver signet ring beneath her high collar felt suddenly heavy, radiating a phantom heat against her skin. Elara closed her eyes, letting her ink-stained fingers rest on the cold parchment. The touch of the silver ring always brought the memory back sharp and unyielding. She was 14 again. The winter wind was howling through the cracks of a dilapidated exile cabin at the very edge of the kingdom. Her mother, the true queen of Ethelgard, lay on a bed of dirty straw, her breathing shallow and ragged. The woman who had once worn the winter crown was reduced to skin and bone, her true name erased by Chancellor Vance's forged decrees. "Do not weep, Elara," her mother had whispered, pressing the silver signet ring into Elara's small, shaking palm. The metal was slick with sweat and cold. "Tears will not buy back a stolen throne. They have the army. They have the council. But they do not have the Founder's Vault. And without it, their crown is only a gilded lie." Her mother had coughed, a terrible rattling sound before her grip tightened with sudden, terrifying strength. You will hide in their shadows. You will learn their lies. And when the time is right, you will use this ring to remind the kingdom who the true blood belongs to." Elara opened her eyes, gasping softly in the freezing archive. The memory faded, leaving only the smell of decaying paper and cold stone. She straightened her spine, pushing the pain down into the locked, ironclad compartment of her heart. She could not afford grief. Grief was a luxury for those who did not have a kingdom to take back. A sound broke the silence. It was not the shuffling step of the elderly master archivist. It was the sharp, measured strike of leather boots against marble stairs, heavy, commanding, and entirely out of place in the forgotten depths of the palace. Elara quickly rolled the census parchment and shoved it beneath a stack of blank ledgers. She stood up, brushing the dust from her skirt, her jaw tightening as the footsteps grew louder. A tall figure emerged from the shadows of the iron stacks. King Alaric. He looked completely alien in the grim, dirty basement. His midnight blue velvet coat was pristine, the silver embroidery gleaming even in the dim candlelight. He did not look like a man who belonged among forgotten things. He looked like the absolute authority of the world above, descended into the dark. He stopped a few feet from her table, his piercing, frost-gray eyes sweeping over the cramped space, the flickering candle, and finally her. He noticed the mud still clinging to her dress. He noticed her ink-stained fingers, resting calmly on the edge of the table. "Your Grace," Elara said. Her voice was quiet, respectful, yet entirely empty of the fear a servant should feel when cornered by a king in the dark. She did not curtsy this time. There was no court watching. Alaric stared at her. His square jaw was tense. He had spent the last 4 hours in his immaculate study, trying to focus on the trade agreements for the Winter Solstice. But the absolute stillness of her hazel eyes in the throne room had haunted him. "The succession records from the year of your father's ascension are missing their final royal seals." Her words had been a hook in his logical, order-driven mind. "Show me," Alaric commanded. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the cold air. Elara did not pretend to misunderstand. She turned, walking calmly to the third aisle. The space between the towering shelves was narrow. When Alaric followed her, the sheer breadth of his shoulders seemed to take up all the oxygen in the aisle. He was so close she could smell the cold, sharp scent of pine and polished leather radiating from him. She reached the 5th shelf, pulled down a massive, leather-bound volume, thick with dust, and turned to face him. She did not hand it to him immediately. "This is the registry of the crown from 30 years ago," Elara said, her voice steady. "The original documents before Chancellor Vance began compiling the master ledgers." Alaric looked at the heavy book, then at her face. He was not used to anyone looking at him so directly. "Give it to me." Elara held the book out. As Alaric took it, his gloved hand brushed against her bare, ink-stained knuckles. He frowned slightly at the contact, perhaps registering how freezing her skin was, but he said nothing. He opened the book, resting it on a nearby reading stand, and pulled a pair of silver reading glasses from his coat pocket. He flipped through the brittle pages with practiced care. He was a scholar king, a man who believed the truth, lived in ink. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the archive was the rustle of turning pages and their synchronized breathing. Then Alaric stopped. His gloved finger traced the edge of a page. He turned it back. He turned it forward. A deep furrow appeared between his brows. Elara watched him, her spine straight as a blade. She knew exactly what he was looking at. "The transition decrees," Alaric murmured almost to himself. "The documentation of my father taking the crown from the failing Valerius line." "Yes, your grace," Elara said quietly. Alaric looked up, his gray eyes suddenly sharp and dangerous. "The pages are here. The text is here. But the royal seals of the ruling council confirming the transition, they are absent," Elara finished for him. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "The wax marks at the bottom of the page are blank. They were stamped with a generic court seal, not the king's signet, nor the founder's mark." Alaric closed the book with a heavy thud. He took off his silver glasses, his jaw locking so tight the muscle twitched. He was a man whose entire worldview was built on the flawless legality of his father's reign. Finding a procedural gap in the most important document in the kingdom was not just an anomaly. To him, it was a structural collapse. "Why did you look for this?" Alaric demanded, his voice dropping into a deadly threatening register. He stepped closer to her, using his physical presence to intimidate. "Who asked a lowly archivist to audit the succession of House Vane?" Elara held her ground. She tilted her head, her hazel eyes locking onto his piercing gray ones. The silver ring under her collar seemed to burn against her skin. "No one asked me, Your Grace," she said softly. "But when you live in the dark, you learn to see the cracks in the foundation much clearer than those who stand in the light." Alaric stared at her. He saw the frayed collar of her dress, the dirt on her skirt, the permanent ink on her fingers. By every law of his kingdom, she was nothing. A ghost, a servant. Yet standing in the freezing shadows of the archive, she possessed a quiet, unyielding gravity that made him feel as if he were the one being judged. He reached into his coat and pulled out his silver pocket watch, checking the time not out of necessity, but out of a sudden desperate need to touch something familiar, and ordered, "You will speak of this to no one." Alaric ordered, his tone absolute. "If I find that you have breathed a word of this missing seal to the Chancellor, or to any noble in my court, the punishment will be severe." "I have no interest in speaking to your Chancellor, Your Grace," Elara replied. "I only have an interest in destroying him." Alaric gave her one last, long, unreadable look. He turned on his heel and walked out of the aisle, his heavy boots echoing into the distance. Elara stood alone in the dark. She placed a trembling hand over her collarbone, pressing against the silver signet ring. The first crack in the Winter King's armor had been made, but she knew Chancellor Vance would not wait for the king to find the truth. The real war was about to begin. The king's private study was a fortress of polished mahogany, towering windows, and absolute order. A heavy fire burned in the hearth, struggling against the pervasive bone-aching chill that seemed to seep through the very stones of the Frost Palace. King Alaric sat behind his massive desk, but he was not working. He was staring at the silver pocket watch resting on the pristine blotter. The rhythmic ticking of the timepiece usually brought him comfort, a reminder of the structured, predictable world he had built. But today the sound was maddening. It sounded like a countdown. The wax marks at the bottom of the page are blank. Elara's voice, quiet and entirely devoid of fear, echoed in his mind. Alaric rubbed his temples, his jaw tightly clenched. He had built his entire reign on the premise that his father had saved Ethelgard from a decaying, incompetent dynasty. House Vane was the law. The royal master ledger was infallible. But the absence of the founding seals on the transition decree was a legal void he could not ignore. He was a scholar of the law, and he knew a forged foundation when he saw one. Before he could resolve the twisting knot in his chest, the heavy oak doors of the study swung open. Lord Chancellor Vance entered, his heavy maroon robes sweeping silently across the carpet. Vance did not wait to be announced. He moved with the oily, practiced confidence of a man who knew he controlled the levers of the kingdom. In his pale, bony hands, he carried a roll of thick parchment, bound in black ribbon. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace," Vance said, his voice a smooth, deferential purr that never quite reached his hooded brown eyes. "But the preparations for the Winter Solstice coronation renewal require your immediate attention." Alaric looked up, his frost-gray eyes narrowing slightly. "I have already approved the banquet arrangements and the military parade chancellor. What more is there?" Vance stepped to the desk and unrolled the parchment, smoothing it flat with a pale hand. "It is a matter of kingdom security, my king. The lower archives, the deepest vaults, have suffered extensive water damage and structural decay. The old, rotting documents of the previous era are becoming a hazard to the palace foundations. I have drafted an edict to permanently seal the 3 lowest levels." Alaric went very still. His gaze dropped to the document. The Edict of Solstice Purity. It called for the heavy iron doors of the lower vaults to be locked, chained, and welded shut. Forever. Sealed. Alaric repeated the word, tasting strange on his tongue. "You wish to entomb the kingdom's history. I wish to protect your legacy," Vance corrected smoothly, stepping closer. "Tomorrow night you will stand before the nobles and renew your vow to the crown. You will solidify the Vane dynasty for 1,000 years. We cannot have the ghosts of House Valerius, or their decaying, irrelevant records haunting the edges of your glorious court. It is a necessary cleansing. Alaric stared at the parchment. He thought of the freezing basement. He thought of the heavy leather book containing the transition decrees, and he thought of the archivist in the mud-stained gray dress, her ink-stained fingers resting on the missing seals. If he signed this, the book would be locked away. The discrepancy would be buried under iron and lead. His reign would remain unquestioned. "Is this truly about structural decay, Vance?" Alaric asked, his voice dangerously low. Vance did not blink. His smile remained fixed, a thin line of absolute political ruthlessness. "It is about order, Your Grace. The same order your father fought and bled to establish. You are the Winter King. Do not let meaningless dust distract you from the strength of your throne." Alaric hated the hesitation in his own chest. He hated that a common girl kneeling in the mud had managed to shake his absolute certainty. He reached for his iron-nibbed pen. He was a king. Kings did not doubt their own blood. He dipped the pen in the inkwell and signed his name with sharp, aggressive strokes. Vance swiftly dripped hot red wax beside the signature. Alaric pressed his royal signet ring into the cooling wax, the heavy seal finalizing the death of the old world. "I will see to it immediately, Your Grace," Vance murmured, rolling the parchment and bowing low. As the Chancellor walked out of the study, Alaric looked back at his silver pocket watch. He had preserved the law. So why did he feel like he had just committed treason? 3 levels below, in the suffocating cold of the archive, the silence was shattered by the brutal metallic clank of heavy chains. Elara stood abruptly from her reading table, her ink-stained fingers slipping on the edge of the wood. The harsh light of torches spilled down the narrow stone stairwell, followed by the heavy marching boots of the palace guard. There were a dozen of them, clad in dark iron armor, carrying thick iron chains and heavy padlocks. The captain of the guard stepped into the dim archive, unrolling a parchment bearing a fresh, blood-red wax seal. "By order of the king and the Lord Chancellor," the captain announced, his voice echoing off the towering bookshelves. "The 3 lowest levels of the Royal Archive are to be evacuated immediately. The doors will be chained tonight and welded shut at dawn. All personnel are to report to the upper levels." Elara's breath caught. Her throat closed, the coarse wool of her collar suddenly feeling like a noose. Underneath it, the silver signet ring seemed to burn like a brand. She stared at the captain, her mind racing with a terrifying mathematical clarity. The lowest level of the archive was not just a storage room. The back wall of the 3rd vault held the concealed iron door of the Founder's Vault. If they welded the entrance to the lower levels, the Founder's Vault would be entombed behind 10 feet of solid rock and iron. Her mother's bloodline, the true succession decree, the only proof that House Vane was a dynasty of thieves. All of it would be sealed away forever. "Captain," Elara said, stepping forward. Her spine was straight, her voice controlled, though every muscle in her body was screaming in panic. "The lower levels contain structural blueprints of the palace. It will take days to properly catalog and relocate them." The captain looked at her, his eyes dismissing her faded gray dress and mud-stained hem in an instant. "I don't care if it contains the king's own gold archivist. You have until nightfall to clear out your personal belongings. At first light, the welders arrive. Move." He gestured to his men, who immediately began dragging the heavy chains toward the lower stairwell. The horrific scraping of iron on stone filled the archive. Elara stood frozen in the shadows. The slow, quiet game of endurance she had played for 12 years was over. Chancellor Vance had realized the danger, or perhaps the king's sudden interest in the old records had spooked him. It did not matter. They were closing the trap. She pressed her trembling hand flat against her chest, feeling the hard shape of the silver ring through her dress. Her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had less than 24 hours before the Winter Solstice coronation renewal. By tomorrow night, King Alaric would stand beneath the crystal chandeliers and publicly cement the false Vane legacy for another generation. And the true queen's history would be locked in a tomb of welded iron. Elara let her hand drop to her side, her jaw locked tight, her hazel eyes hardening into something sharp and dangerous in the candlelight. She would not let her mother die a second time in the dark. If the King of Ethelgard wanted to seal the past, she was going to have to drag it out into the light and force him to choke on it. Night had fallen over the Frost Palace, dropping the temperature in the upper corridors to a biting, bitter chill. The grand marble hallways were empty, save for the palace guards standing like iron statues at the intersections. Tomorrow was the Winter Solstice coronation renewal. The entire court was either asleep or frantically preparing for the banquet. Elara walked down the dimly lit East Gallery, her arms wrapped around a heavy stack of relocated ledgers. The chains had been placed on the lower archive doors, but the welders would not arrive until dawn. She had only hours left. Her gray wool dress was still stained with mud at the hem, and her ink-stained fingers ached from the cold, but she forced her spine to remain perfectly straight. She was moving toward the upper repository, but her mind was calculating a dozen impossible ways to break a rusted iron lock before sunrise. As she rounded the corner near the king's private study, she froze. King Alaric stood alone by the towering arched windows, looking out over the snow-covered courtyards. He had removed his heavy velvet coat, wearing only a pristine white shirt and a dark silver-embroidered vest, but the cold seemed to have no effect on him. In his gloved hands, he held his silver pocket watch, turning it over and over. He was not checking the time. He was running his thumb across the engraved royal crest, as if trying to read the metal like Braille. Elara stepped back into the shadows, intending to slip away, but the floorboards beneath the marble runner let out a faint creak. Alaric turned instantly. His frost-gray eyes locked onto her, sharp and predatory in the dim candlelight. "Archivist," he said. His voice was low, echoing softly in the empty hall. "You are far from your newly assigned quarters." Elara did not flinch. She stepped out of the shadows, her chin lifted, and offered the same flawless, shallow curtsy she had given him in the throne room. "I am delivering the final census ledgers to the upper repository. Your Grace, as ordered by the Lord Chancellor's evacuation edict." Alaric's jaw tightened at the mention of the edict. He looked at her, truly, looked at her. He saw the permanent ink on her fingers wrapped tightly around the ledgers. He saw the mud on her hem that she wore like a badge of quiet defiance. And he saw the absolute lack of intimidation in her hazel eyes. "Put them down," Alaric ordered softly. Elara hesitated for a fraction of a second, then set the heavy ledgers on a nearby mahogany side table. She stood before him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Under her high collar, the silver signet ring felt like a piece of ice pressing against her skin. Alaric stepped closer. The ticking of his silver pocket watch was the only sound in the corridor. "You told me the succession seals were missing. You planted a seed of treason in my own archive, and then you walked away. I planted nothing. Your Grace," Elara said, her voice a calm, even murmur, "I only showed you the soil. What grows there is the truth." Alaric frowned, a dark, dangerous expression crossing his handsome face. He held up the silver pocket watch, the metal catching the moonlight. "The truth. You speak of it as if you own it. My Chancellor tells me your family was stripped of their title for harboring traitors. He tells me you are a remnant of a corrupt era. Why should I believe a word you say?" Elara looked at the pocket watch. She had seen him check it a dozen times in the throne room. It was his anchor, his proof of lineage. "May I see it, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. Alaric paused. To hand a personal royal heirloom to a servant was a profound breach of protocol. But the King of Ethelgard was a scholar first, and the quiet certainty in her eyes compelled him. He unclipped the silver chain from his vest and placed the heavy silver timepiece into her ink-stained palm. Elara held it carefully. It was a beautiful forgery. "Your grandfather's watch," Elara said, her tone conversational, though her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The founder of the Vane dynasty, passed down to your father and then to you, forged in the fires of the northern provinces before the unification," Alaric said, reciting the history he had been taught since childhood. "It bears the original crest of my house, proof of our enduring right to rule." Elara traced the engraving on the silver casing with her thumb. "It is a masterful piece of craftsmanship, Your Grace. The Vane falcon is flawless, but there is a discrepancy." Alaric stiffened. "Explain." "The crest engraved here," Elara said, holding the watch up so the moonlight hit the metal. "The falcon is surrounded by 7 stars. Do you see them? The 7 stars of the Ethelgard territories," Alaric said, his voice hardening. "What of it?" Elara did not blink. She looked directly into his eyes and delivered the intellectual checkmate that would destroy his world. "There were only 6 provinces when your grandfather was alive, Your Grace. The 7th star represents the Valerius lands, the southern territory that was not conquered and absorbed into the kingdom until 10 years after your father took the throne, long after your grandfather died." The silence in the corridor became absolute suffocating. "That is impossible," Alaric whispered. "It is chronological history, Your Grace," Elara replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady. "A watch forged by your grandfather before the unification could not possibly bear 7 stars, unless of course the watch is not an ancient family heirloom at all, unless it was commissioned recently by Lord Chancellor Vance, aged artificially, and engraved with a modern crest to legitimize a dynasty that has no real roots in the past." Alaric stared at the watch in her hand. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin as pale as the marble beneath their feet. He was a man of documents, of logic, of timelines. The physical proof of the anachronism hit him harder than a physical blow. The ticking of the watch suddenly sounded disjointed, false a mechanical lie echoing in the empty hall. His breathing grew shallow. He reached out and snatched the watch from her hand, his gloved fingers trembling slightly. He stared at the 7 stars. He counted them, over and over. 7. "Who are you?" Alaric asked. His voice was no longer a royal command. It was a raw, fractured breath. Elara stood tall. She did not reach for the silver ring under her collar. Not yet. She simply looked at the king who had humiliated her, watching his absolute certainty shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "I am the archivist you commanded to kneel in the mud, Your Grace," Elara said softly, her hazel eyes completely unyielding. "I am the woman you called unworthy of your name." She offered him one last slight inclination of her head and turned walking away down the dark corridor, leaving the ledgers on the table. Alaric did not call her back. He stood frozen in the moonlight, his fingers gripping the silver watch so tightly the metal bit through his gloves. He looked toward the grand staircase leading to his royal bedchamber. Then slowly, he turned his head toward the dark, narrow stairwell that led down to the lower archives. The welders were coming at dawn. Alaric shoved the forged watch into his pocket. His jaw locked. He bypassed his guards, ignoring their confused salutes, and descended into the dark. The air in the 3rd and lowest level of the Royal Archive was thin, tasting of iron and centuries of undisturbed dust. King Alaric stood alone in the suffocating darkness, holding a single flickering lantern. He had bypassed the heavy iron chains the guards had left draped over the stairwell, trespassing in his own palace. His gloved hands were trembling. He had stripped off his heavy velvet coat, leaving it draped over a reading stand unbothered by the freezing temperature. The cold radiating from his own mind was far worse. For the past 2 hours, the Scholar King had done what he did best. He had audited his own history. Spread across the scarred wooden table were the fragmented, decaying ledgers of the transition period. Alaric cross-referenced the dates, the tax records, the military deployments. Every piece of logic he applied to the founding of House Vane crumbled under scrutiny. The military victory his father supposedly won was a massacre of a surrendered court. The grand treaties were forged. The chronological impossibilities multiplied the deeper he looked. And then he found the registry of the deposed House Valerius. Alaric ran a gloved finger down the brittle yellowed page. His breath caught in his throat, a plume of white vapor suspended in the dim light. It was a birth record written by the royal physician 30 years ago. The true queen's daughter, the record read. Born in the Winter Solstice. Hazel eyes flecked with gold. A delicate bone structure, but a spine of iron. Alaric's hand drifted to his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold, forged silver of the pocket watch. The archivist, the girl with the ink-stained fingers and the mud-stained hem who had looked at him with absolute, unyielding defiance while kneeling on the freezing marble of his throne room. She was not a remnant of a corrupt era. She was the rightful heir to the very floor she knelt upon. He had called the true princess of Ethelgard unworthy of his name. A sharp physical ache seized his chest. It was the agony of a man whose entire moral compass had just shattered. He needed to find her. He needed to. Above him, on the first level of the archive, the heavy sound of a door grinding open echoed down the stairwell. Alaric immediately extinguished his lantern. He stood in absolute darkness, listening. It was not the clumsy, dragging shuffle of the welders arriving for the dawn shift. It was the crisp, synchronized striking of leather boots, palace guards, moving with stealth, not ceremony. 4 levels up in his lavish, heavily guarded chambers, Lord Chancellor Vance stood by a roaring fire. He was fully dressed in his maroon robes, wide awake. A shadow separated itself from the corner of the room, a lieutenant of the guard loyal only to the Chancellor's coin. "The archivist, my lord," the lieutenant whispered. She was seen speaking to the king in the East Gallery. He handed her his pocket watch. When she left, the king did not return to his chambers. He went down into the archive. Vance's sallow face tightened. His hooded eyes gleamed with a sudden vicious panic. He turned toward the fire, the orange light casting demonic shadows across his hollow cheeks. "She knows," Vance hissed, his hands clenching into fists. "I should have killed the Valerius girl the day we exiled her mother. I thought burying her in the dirt of the lower levels would break her mind. But she has been reading. She has been waiting." Vance turned back to the lieutenant, his voice dropping to a deadly, absolute command. "Take 3 of your best men. Go down to the lowest vault. Do not wait for the welders. Slit her throat, leave her body behind the iron doors, and weld the chains shut. If the king is down there, create a distraction. But the girl must not see the sunrise." Deep in the 3rd level, Elara was not hiding. She was working. She stood at the very back of the archive, where the iron shelves met the solid bedrock of the mountain. Before her was a heavy rusted iron door, devoid of any handle or keyhole. The only feature on its surface was a small circular depression in the center, perfectly shaped to fit a silver signet ring. This was the entrance to the founder's vault. Elara held a small iron chisel, frantically chipping away at the thick layer of limestone and dust that had accumulated over the lock mechanism. Her gray wool dress was soaked with freezing sweat. Her hands ached, her knuckles bruised and bleeding slightly from the exertion mingling with the dark ink stains. She just needed to clear the lock. If she could prep the mechanism tonight, she could expose the truth at the Winter Solstice banquet tomorrow. Clank. The sound of a sword being drawn from its scabbard echoed through the dark labyrinth of shelves. Elara froze. The chisel slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the stone floor with a sharp crack. "There!" A low, brutal voice echoed from the aisle to her left. "By the back wall." Elara's blood ran cold. The heavy footsteps were accelerating. She pressed her back against the iron door of the founder's vault, her breath trapped painfully beneath her tight corset. She reached up her trembling fingers, gripping the silver signet ring hidden beneath her collar. 3 palace guards stepped out of the shadows, their drawn swords gleaming in the faint light of a single shuttered lantern. They wore the dark iron armor of the Vane dynasty, but their eyes held the ruthless intent of assassins. "The Chancellor sends his regards, Your Highness," the lead guard sneered, stepping forward, his boots crunching over the scattered ledgers. Elara did not scream. She did not beg. She lifted her chin, her hazel eyes locking onto the executioners with the absolute freezing dignity of a queen. If she was going to die in the dark, she would die standing. "You serve a traitor," Elara said, her voice a quiet, lethal whip in the freezing air. "And you are standing on sacred ground." The guard laughed, raising his sword. "Sacred or not, it will be your tomb." He lunged forward, the heavy steel blade cutting through the cold air, aimed directly at her chest. Before Elara could even brace for the impact, a massive shadow erupted from the adjacent aisle. King Alaric slammed into the guard with the devastating grounded force of a battering ram. He had no sword, no armor, only his white shirt and silver vest, but he was a king raised on military discipline. He seized the guard's wrist, twisting it with a sickening snap. The sword clattered to the stone. Alaric drove his elbow into the man's throat, dropping him instantly to the floor. The remaining 2 guards froze in sheer, paralyzed horror, as the Scholar King stood up slowly in the dim light. His chest was heaving, his jaw locked, his frost-gray eyes burning with a murderous, absolute rage they had never seen before. He stepped between the assassins and Elara, shielding her completely with his broad shoulders. "Treason," Alaric whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, lethal authority. "In my own house." The micro cliffhanger hung in the freezing air. The king had chosen his side, but they were entirely unarmed, trapped in the deepest vault of the palace, and the Chancellor's men had orders to leave no survivors. The archive was plunged into a breathless, violent fraction of a second. The two remaining palace guards, realizing the King of Ethelgard was entirely unarmed, made their choice. Treason once begun could not be halted. "Kill them both!" The taller guard snarled, lunging forward with a sweeping arc of his steel blade. Alaric did not step back. The Scholar King was a man of the mind, but he had been raised under the punishing physical discipline of a military court. He ducked under the lethal swing, the blade whistling mere inches from his dark hair. Using the guard's own momentum, Alaric drove his shoulder into the man's breastplate, sending him crashing backward into the towering iron shelves. A cascade of heavy dust-covered ledgers rained down upon them in a deafening clatter. But the third guard was already moving, circling Alaric's blind side, raising his sword to bring the pommel down on the king's unprotected skull. Elara did not scream. She did not cower against the vault door. She dropped to her knees, her mud-stained gray skirt pooling on the freezing stone, and snatched the heavy iron chisel she had dropped moments before. As the guard stepped forward, Elara drove the chisel upward with every ounce of her strength, burying the blunt iron edge into the unprotected gap of the guard's knee armor. The man roared in agony, his leg buckling instantly. His sword struck the marble floor with a shower of sparks. Before he could recover, Alaric pivoted, seizing the heavy iron-bound spine of a fallen tax ledger, and struck the guard across the temple. The man collapsed unconscious. The archive fell into a sudden ringing silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Alaric stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his pristine white shirt now smeared with archive dust and a streak of blood that was not his own. He looked at Elara. She was still kneeling, her ink-stained, bruised hands gripping the iron chisel so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. She was terrified, yes, but her hazel eyes were fiercely, brilliantly alive. From the top of the stairwell, 4 levels above, the echoing shouts of more men drifted down. The Chancellor's reinforcements. "We cannot hold the stairs," Alaric said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He reached down, offering her his hand. Elara looked at his large, gloved hand for a fraction of a second. Then she took it. His grip was warm, solid, and completely unhesitating as he pulled her to her feet. "We do not need the stairs," Elara whispered. She turned to the solid stone wall adjacent to the Founder's vault. She pressed her bleeding fingers against the cold limestone, tracing a pattern only the true bloodline of the palace knew. She found the recessed brick, pressing her weight into it. With a low, grinding groan, a narrow section of the wall shifted inward, revealing a pitch-black passage. "The old servant corridors," Elara said, stepping into the dark. "Built by my grandfather. The Vane dynasty never bothered to map them." Alaric followed her, pulling the heavy stone door shut, just as the chaotic light of torches flooded the aisle behind them. The passage was suffocatingly narrow. Alaric's broad shoulders brushed the damp, freezing stone on either side. They moved in absolute darkness, the only sound the rustle of Elara's coarse wool skirt, and their synchronized, careful footsteps. The air smelled of ancient earth and forgotten time. For 20 minutes they climbed upward through the hidden arteries of the Frost Palace. The physical exertion was nothing compared to the crushing emotional weight pressing down on Alaric. He was walking behind the woman he had publicly humiliated. He had commanded her to grovel in the mud. He had called her unworthy of the name Vane. And yet here she was, bleeding and bruised, leading him to safety through a palace that rightfully belonged to her. Finally, Elara stopped. She pressed against another stone mechanism, and a heavy wooden panel gave way. They stumbled into a sealed, forgotten chamber. Pale moonlight filtered through a single, heavily grime-crusted window near the ceiling. The room was draped in white dust sheets, an old solar abandoned when House Vane took the palace. Elara moved to a dusty side table and struck a match, lighting a solitary stubby candle. The warm, flickering light illuminated her face. She looked devastated by exhaustion. The hem of her gray dress was ruined. Her corset was visibly restricting her panicked breathing, and her hands were a bruised, ink-stained mess. Alaric stood near the hidden doorway. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the last remnants of his arrogant, documented worldview shattered into dust. "Princess Elara," Alaric said. The title hung in the cold, quiet air, heavy with 30 years of stolen history. Elara stopped, wiping the blood from her knuckles. She slowly turned to face him. She did not deny it. She did not break eye contact. She stood with the exact same unyielding posture she had held in the throne room. "My father slaughtered your house," Alaric whispered, the horror of his own lineage finally breaking his voice. He took a step forward, his frost-gray eyes filled with a devastating, raw agony. "He built this kingdom on a lie, and I defended it. I looked at you, the rightful heir to this floor, and I commanded you to kneel. I called you unworthy. You trusted the ink, Your Grace," Elara said quietly, her voice devoid of malice, which somehow made it hurt him more. "But the ink was bought with my mother's blood." Alaric closed his eyes, his jaw locking tight as a tremor wrecked his broad frame. "How did you survive it? The silence, the humiliation, watching me wear a crown that belongs to you. Because anger burns out, King Alaric," Elara said, taking a step toward him. Her hand rose, her bruised fingers touching the silver signet ring beneath her collar. "But the law does not. I did not survive to seek revenge. I survived to seek justice. And tonight the Founder's Vault will open, and the true law will be spoken." She turned away from him and walked toward the corner of the room. Beneath a heavy canvas dropcloth sat a massive iron-bound cedar trunk. Elara knelt beside it, producing a small iron key from her apron pocket. The lock clicked open. Alaric watched in silence as Elara folded back layers of protective oilcloth and dried lavender. From the depths of the trunk, she lifted a garment that seemed to capture the very moonlight in the room. It was a gown of deep, breathtaking emerald silk. The fabric was rich and heavy, completely untouched by time. Across the bodice and down the sweeping train, the silver crest of House Valerius, a sunburst framed by winter lilies, was meticulously embroidered in pure silver thread. It was not merely a dress, it was a royal declaration of war. Elara held the silk against her chest. For 12 years she had worn coarse, scratching wool. She had worn mud and dust and ink. Now the emerald silk spilled over her bruised hands, a stark, beautiful contrast to her suffering. "The Winter Solstice coronation renewal begins in 4 hours," Elara said, her hazel eyes locking onto Alaric's over the shimmering fabric. "Lord Chancellor Vance will expect you to walk into the banquet hall and swear your bloodline to the realm. He will expect me to be dead at the bottom of the archive." She stepped closer, the true queen holding her armor. "You asked me who I was. Your Grace," Elara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, elegant calm. "Tonight the kingdom will know. The question is no longer who I am. The question is, when I walk into the light, will you stand with the forged law of your father or the true law of this kingdom?" Alaric looked at the woman who was too good for his name, too strong for his cruelty, and too brilliant to be buried. The Scholar King dropped to one knee, the cold floor biting through his trousers, and bowed his head. "I will tear my own throne down." Alaric swore, his voice rough with absolute unshakable devotion. "Command me, my queen." Dawn was breaking over Ethelgard. The shadows were retreating. It was time to take back the crown. The Winter Solstice banquet hall was a masterclass in opulent deception. Suspended from the vaulted ceiling, 3 massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, blinding light over the polished marble floor. The room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the heavy, expensive perfumes of the 200 nobles gathered within. They wore silk velvet and gold, whispering behind painted fans and crystal goblets, entirely oblivious to the blood that stained the foundations of the Frost Palace. At the head of the hall stood the grand dais where the throne of Ethelgard rested beneath banners of midnight blue and silver. Lord Chancellor Vance stood near the steps of the dais, draped in his heavy maroon robes. His sallow face was flushed with the heat of the room and the intoxicating thrill of absolute victory. At dawn, his lieutenant had reported that the heavy iron chains on the lower archive doors had been successfully welded shut. Whatever remained of the Valerius girl and the dangerous truths she had unearthed was now entombed behind 10 feet of impenetrable iron and rock. The past was dead. The Vane dynasty was secure, and by extension so was Vance's iron grip on the kingdom. A sudden hush fell over the hall as the royal trumpet sounded. King Alaric walked into the banquet hall, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He wore his formal state attire, a high-collared coat of black velvet, threaded with silver, the heavy winter crown resting perfectly upon his dark hair. But it was his demeanor that sent a ripple of unease through the gathered nobility. The scholar king, usually composed and elegantly detached, moved with the terrifying, restrained stillness of a predator. His square jaw was locked. His piercing, frost-gray eyes swept over the room, devoid of any celebratory warmth. In his gloved right hand, he held the silver pocket watch, his thumb resting heavily over the forged 7-star crest. Alaric ascended the dais. He did not sit on the throne. He stood beside it, his gaze fixing on Chancellor Vance with a cold, unreadable intensity. "My king," Vance murmured, offering a deep, sweeping bow. "The court is assembled. The kingdom awaits your vow." Alaric gave a single imperceptible nod. "Proceed, Chancellor." Vance turned to face the sea of nobles. He unrolled a long, gold-trimmed parchment, his voice carrying effortlessly over the absolute silence of the hall. "Lords and ladies of Ethelgard." Vance began, his tone dripping with practiced reverence. "We gather tonight on the Winter Solstice to honor the unbroken line of House Vane. 30 years ago, this kingdom was fractured. It was a dark era of weakness and decay. But through the strength of the Winter King's father order was restored. Tonight we renew the vow of succession. We swear our blood, our lands, and our lives to the true and documented law of this realm." The nobles raised their goblets in a unified, glittering salute. "Long live the king!" Vance shouted, raising his own hands. "Long live the unbroken line!" Clack! The sound of the massive oak doors at the back of the hall being thrown open did not just interrupt the cheer, it shattered it entirely. The heavy wood struck the stone walls with a deafening boom that echoed up into the vaulted ceiling. Every head in the banquet hall turned. Vance lowered his arms, his hooded brown eyes narrowing in deep irritation at the disruption. A lone figure stood in the threshold. It was not a late-arriving duke. It was not a palace guard. It was a queen. Elara stepped into the blinding light of the chandeliers. The collective breath of 200 nobles caught in their throats. She was wearing the deep emerald silk gown she had pulled from the cedar trunk. The fabric moved like liquid glass as she walked the heavy train, sweeping majestically over the marble floor. Across her bodice, the silver crest of House Valerius, a sunburst framed by winter lilies, gleamed with a blinding, undeniable brilliance. 12 years of exile. 12 years of coarse gray wool, of freezing shadows, of sweeping floors, and keeping her eyes lowered. All of it vanished into the ether. She walked with a spine so impossibly straight, a presence so quietly, devastatingly commanding, that the nobles instinctively stepped back, parting like the sea to make way for her. Vance's face drained of all color, shifting from flushed triumph to the sickly gray of a corpse. His pale hands began to tremble so violently that the gold-trimmed parchment slipped from his grasp, fluttering uselessly to the marble steps. "It cannot be," Vance whispered, his voice cracking. He stared at the woman who was supposed to be a rotting corpse in the dark. Elara continued down the long center aisle. The visual contrast was jarring, beautiful, and terrifying. She wore the immaculate, priceless silk of a high-born royal, but she had refused to wear gloves. Her hands resting elegantly before her were visibly bruised. The knuckles were raw and cut from driving an iron chisel into a guard's armor, and the faint dark stains of archive ink still marked her fingertips. They were the hands of a woman who had physically fought her way out of a grave to take back her throne. Resting between those bruised, ink-stained fingers was a small, heavy silver signet ring suspended on a chain. As Elara neared the dais, the silence was so profound that the crisp rustle of her emerald silk was the only sound in the world. "Guards!" Vance shrieked, his composure shattering entirely. Panic clawed at his throat. He pointed a trembling, bony finger at her. "Arrest this woman! She is an imposter! A traitor sees her immediately!" A dozen palace guards at the edges of the room drew their steel, stepping forward to intercept her. "Hold!" The single word erupted from the dais. It was not a shout. It was a physical blow. King Alaric stepped forward, his frost-gray eyes blazing with an absolute lethal authority that froze the guards in their tracks. He did not look at Vance. He looked only at Elara. "Stand down," Alaric commanded, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. "No blade will be drawn in this hall." Vance wheeled around, staring at the king in utter horror. "Your Grace, she is a remnant. She wears the forbidden crest. I must listen, Chancellor." Alaric interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He pocketed the forged silver watch and stood perfectly still. "As must you." Elara reached the base of the dais, the very same marble steps where just 24 hours ago she had knelt in a mud-stained dress, while Alaric called her unworthy of the air in the room. Now she stood tall, looking up at the king, and the king looked down at her, not with arrogant dismissal, but with breathless, silent reverence. Elara turned her gaze to Chancellor Vance. Her hazel eyes were calm, devoid of rage, possessing only the terrifying, unshakable weight of absolute justice. "You spoke of the documented law of this realm, Chancellor," Elara said. Her voice was not raised, but the exquisite acoustics of the hall carried every syllable to the farthest corners of the room. "You spoke of the unbroken line. But the line you praise is a forgery written in the blood of my family and sealed with lies." The nobility erupted into horrified, breathless murmurs. Elara held up the silver signet ring, letting it catch the light of the chandeliers. "I am Princess Elara of House Valerius." She declared, the true name ringing out in the Frost Palace for the first time in 30 years. "Daughter of the true queen, and I hold the only seal that can open the Founder's vault." She turned her gaze back to the stunned, breathless court, and then finally to Alaric. "The transition decree you base your reign upon is a lie." Elara said, the micro cliffhanger tightening around the throat of the kingdom. "If the king of Ethelgard truly believes in the law, he will order the welders to cut the chains on the lower archive. He will walk with me into the dark, and he will let the Founder's vault speak the truth before the entire court." The silence in the Winter Solstice banquet hall was so fragile, it felt as though a single breath might shatter it. 200 nobles stood paralyzed beneath the blazing crystal chandeliers, their eyes darting between the magnificent, emerald-clad woman at the base of the dais and the imposing figure of the king standing above her. King Alaric did not blink. He looked down at Princess Elara, at the bruised, ink-stained hands that had bled to dig the truth out of the dark. He felt the heavy weight of the forged silver pocket watch in his coat, a cold anchor pulling him down into the reality of what his family had done. "Your Grace, this is madness," Lord Chancellor Vance shrieked, his voice climbing to a hysterical pitch. He scrambled up the first step of the dais, his maroon robes tangling around his ankles. "You cannot entertain the delusions of a common servant. She has forged that ring. If you leave this hall, you insult the nobility. You invalidate the Winter Solstice." Alaric turned his head slowly. The look in his frost-gray eyes was so terrifyingly hollow, so devoid of mercy, that Vance physically recoiled, stumbling backward down the marble step. "Captain Alaric," said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded absolute obedience. "Fetch the ironsmiths. Have them meet us at the stairwell to the lower archives." The captain of the guard, the very man who had delivered the sealing edict that morning, bowed rigidly. "At once, Your Grace. We are going into the dark," Alaric announced, turning his gaze to the sea of terrified nobles. "Every lord and lady in this room will follow. You will witness the foundation of this kingdom, or you will answer to my blade. Move." It was a procession unlike any in the history of Ethelgard. The glittering court of the Frost Palace, dressed in their finest silks, velvets, and heavy jewels, was forced to leave the suffocating warmth of the banquet hall. They descended the grand marble staircases in absolute deathly silence, their footsteps echoing like a funeral march. As they reached the entry to the lower archives, the temperature plummeted. The air turned thin and sharp-smelling of iron-damp stone and centuries of decay. Noblewomen shivered, pulling their fur-lined wraps tightly around their shoulders. The dukes and ministers exchanged nervous, pale glances as their breath began to plume in the freezing air. At the front of the procession walked Elara. Her emerald silk train swept over the dust of the stone steps, a brilliant slash of color in the oppressive gloom. Behind her walked Alaric, his broad shoulders, rigid his face an unreadable mask. Vance trailed them, flanked by 2 guards, sweating profusely, despite the biting cold, his lips moving in silent, frantic panic. They reached the 3rd and lowest level. The flickering light of the guards' torches illuminated the narrow aisles of towering iron shelves, and there at the very back of the labyrinth, blocked by the heavy overlapping iron chains Vance had ordered placed that morning, was the solid rock wall. The chains were thick, and the fresh, jagged welds of molten iron gleamed dully in the torchlight. "Cut them!" Alaric ordered. 2 heavy-set smiths stepped forward with massive iron shears and sledgehammers. The deafening, brutal sound of metal striking metal echoed through the archive, making the nobles wince and cover their ears. It took 5 agonizing minutes to break the hastily made welds. When the final chain fell to the stone floor with a heavy clang, Alaric stepped forward and pushed the iron links aside with his booted foot. He looked at Elara and nodded once. Elara stepped past the king. She approached the solid stone wall adjacent to the shelves. Before the watchful, breathless eyes of the entire court, she pressed her bruised hands against the cold limestone and pushed. With a low, grinding groan, the hidden door gave way, revealing the pitch-black passage she and Alaric had used to escape. But she did not enter the passage. She gestured for the guards to bring their torches closer. As the light spilled into the hidden alcove, it revealed what the stone wall had been concealing: a massive, rusted iron door, seamlessly built into the bedrock of the mountain. There was no handle. There was no keyhole. There was only a single small circular depression in the dead center of the iron. Vance let out a strangled, whimpering sound. He had known the vault existed, but he had never possessed the means to open it. Elara reached up to the collar of her emerald gown. Her ink-stained fingers unclasped the silver chain. She held the silver signet ring in her palm for a moment. It was no magical artifact. It was simply a masterpiece of ancient engineering designed with a specific groove and depth that no forger could replicate without the original casting. She pressed the silver ring into the depression. A heavy mechanical click reverberated through the iron. Deep within the door, a series of ancient tumblers fell into place, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the silent archive. Elara placed both hands on the freezing iron and pushed. The door to the Founder's vault swung open. A wave of perfectly preserved, dry cedar-scented air washed over the crowd. Inside the vault was small, circular, and immaculate. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal of polished white marble. Resting upon it was a heavy, silver-bound cylinder. Elara did not step inside. She turned to King Alaric, her hazel eyes holding the steady, terrifying weight of truth. "The law belongs to the crown," Elara said quietly. "If you are the true king of Ethelgard, your grace, open the cylinder. Read the law to your people." Alaric looked at the cylinder. Every instinct in his body, every survival mechanism forged by 30 years of privilege, screamed at him to order the door welded shut. But he was the Scholar King. He could not live in the dark. He stepped past Elara entering the sacred vault. He lifted the silver cylinder. It was heavy, sealed with a massive stamp of cracked white wax, the true seal of the Founder. Alaric broke the wax with his gloved thumb. He slid the pristine, heavy parchment from its casing and unrolled it. The court held its collective breath. The torches flickered. Alaric's frost-gray eyes scanned the ancient, elegant calligraphy. His chest stopped moving. The words were absolute, legally flawless, and completely devastating. "This is the edict of the first son." Alaric read aloud, his voice low, resonant, and carrying a profound, raw ache. dictated by the founder of Ethelgard. Let it be known to all generations that the absolute right of succession belongs eternally to House Valerius, passing through the maternal line." A gasp rippled through the gathered nobles. Alaric swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the edges of the parchment. He continued reading his own execution warrant. In times of war or peril, military command may be temporarily granted to the wardens of House Vane. However, House Vane possesses no royal blood, no right of coronation, and no claim to the high throne. Their authority is provisional, serving only as the sword for the true queen. Any attempt by House Vane to assume the crown is an act of high treason against the realm. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The master ledger, the transition decrees, the executions, the 30 years of Ethelgard's history. All of it was laid bare as a monstrous, documented lie. The king standing before them was not a king. He was the son of a treasonous general. Alaric slowly lowered the parchment. He looked at the words until they blurred. Then he turned to face the court, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the nobility, past the trembling, weeping Chancellor Vance, until it locked entirely upon the woman in the emerald gown. The true queen of Ethelgard stood waiting, her spine straight as a blade demanding nothing, yet commanding everything. "Lies, it is a Valerius trick." Lord Chancellor Vance's scream shattered the apocalyptic silence of the lower archive. He lunged forward, his maroon robes twisting around him, his face contorted into a mask of absolute rabid desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at the king, then at the open founder's vault. "The parchment is a forgery!" Vance shrieked, spit flying from his pale lips. "The girl planted it. King Alaric has been bewitched by a remnant. Guards, I command you in the name of the royal council, arrest them both. Seize the impostor and the traitor king." The dozen palace guards standing at the perimeter of the archive gripped their swords. The heavy steel scraped against their scabbards, a terrifying sound in the freezing, dust-choked air. They looked at the Chancellor, the man who paid their wages, and then they looked at the king. Alaric did not flinch. He carefully rolled the ancient parchment, securing it with the reverence it deserved, and handed it to Elara. Then the Scholar King turned to face his Chancellor. When Alaric spoke, it was not with the volume of a man desperate for control. It was the quiet, earth-shattering certainty of a man who had finally found the solid ground of the law. The Edict of the First Son explicitly grants military command to the wardens of House Vane. Alaric said, his frost-gray eyes locking onto the captain of the guard. "I am the warden of this realm, and my final command is this: Lord Chancellor Vance is hereby stripped of his titles. Arrest him for high treason, forgery, and the orchestrated murder of the true Valerius bloodline." The captain of the guard did not hesitate. The absolute documented truth of the founder's vault was undeniable. He signaled his men. "No, you cannot do this. I built this kingdom." Vance howled as 4 heavy-set guards seized him by the arms, dragging him backward. His maroon robes dragged through the freezing mud and dust of the archive floor. "I gave you the throne, Alaric. I gave you the world. You gave me a grave," Alaric said softly. "Take him to the darkest cell we have." As Vance's frantic screams faded up the stairwell, a profound, heavy silence settled over the 200 nobles standing in the freezing dark. They were shivering their breath, pluming white in the air, their expensive furs brushing against rusted iron shelves. They stared at the king, waiting to see how a man survived the destruction of his own existence. Alaric reached into his velvet coat. He pulled out the heavy silver pocket watch, the forged heirloom with the impossible 7 stars. He looked at it for one long second, feeling the weight of the lie he had carried his entire life. Then he opened his hand. The silver watch hit the stone floor with a sharp final clack, the glass face shattering into a dozen pieces. For 30 years, Alaric said, his voice echoing over the silent court, "House Vane demanded your loyalty to a lie. We wore a crown bought with the blood of the rightful queen, and we buried the truth in the dark so we could walk in the light. The lie ends tonight." Alaric turned away from the terrified nobility. He walked slowly toward the founder's vault, stopping 2 feet from where Princess Elara stood. Elara did not move. The breathtaking emerald silk of her gown pooled around her on the rough stone. Her spine was perfectly straight. She held the true succession decree in her bruised, ink-stained hands, her hazel eyes locked onto the man who had ordered her to kneel in the dirt only a day ago. Alaric reached up. His gloved hands grasped the heavy diamond-encrusted winter crown resting on his dark hair. It was the symbol of everything he had been raised to revere, the absolute pinnacle of Ethelgard's power. He lifted the crown from his head. The Scholar King stepped down from the authority of the world. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric dropped to one knee on the freezing, dust-covered stone of the lower archive. He bowed his head, holding the winter crown out in his hands, presenting it not as a king, but as a humbled servant of the law. "I commanded you to kneel in the mud," Alaric whispered, his voice raw with a devastating ache that resonated in the hollows of the vault. "I called you unworthy of my name. I was blind to the truth that my name was entirely unworthy of you." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers with absolute surrender. "I submit to the edict of the first son." Alaric swore, his voice firming into a regal, unbreakable vow. "House Vane surrenders the crown. I lay my life and my sword at the feet of the true queen." The silence was absolute. Elara looked down at the man kneeling before her. She remembered the suffocating weight of the corset, the burning cold of the throne room, marble the agony of watching her mother die in exile. The anger had been a fire that kept her alive in the dark. But looking at Alaric now, she felt the fire settle into something far more powerful. It settled into justice. She reached out with her bruised bare hands and took the winter crown. The metal was heavy. It was real. She did not place it on her head immediately. She held it against her chest, the diamonds catching the flickering light of the torches, and looked out over the sea of nobility. The lords and ladies who had mocked her, who had benefited from the Chancellor's lies, were trembling. "I did not survive the dark to rule a kingdom of ghosts," Elara said, her voice smooth, elegant, and vibrating with absolute royal authority. "The forged laws are burned. The debt of blood is answered. Ethelgard belongs to the light once more." She looked down at Alaric. She saw the honor of a man who possessed the courage to destroy his own world for the sake of the truth. "Stand, Warden of House Vane," Elara commanded softly. Alaric's breath hitched. He slowly rose to his feet, standing tall before her, stripped of his crown, but retaining every ounce of his true dignity. "A true queen," Elara said, her hazel eyes softening just a fraction, "does not rule over a broken sword. Your name is clear." Behind them, the captain of the guard drew his sword and dropped to one knee on the cold stone. It was the catalyst the court needed. In a sweeping, rustling wave of heavy silk and velvet, 200 nobles sank to their knees in the freezing dust of the lower archive. The proud, glittering court of the Frost Palace bowed their heads in absolute submission. Elara of House Valerius lifted the winter crown and placed it upon her own head. She stood in the flickering torchlight, framed by the open iron doors of the Founder's Vault, the true queen who had walked out of the shadows to force the kingdom to its knees. The documented law was finally fulfilled, and the truth she knew would never be buried again.
"The throne's light will guide us to truth and unity."